In his new novel, The Motorcyclist, George Elliott Clarke shares a world out of his own father's diary from the late 1950s in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's a remarkable journey on the highways and byways of history, family, race, class, and sex. George Elliott Clarke is a Governor General award-winning poet, playwright, and author, and he's also currently Canadian Parliamentary Poet Laureate. He joins us now. I'm so excited to speak to you.
Oh, man, thank you.
If I become a fangirl, please. It's not often that you get to do this.
Thank
but
you.
The Motorcyclist, it's based on your father's journal. And it's a book that had all of my emotions all over the place, from happy, sad to heartbreak. So where do the facts stop and where does the fiction start?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, it's an impossible question. I state in the beginning of the novel that yes, the source is my late father's diary, but I did feel free as a writer and as a novelist, because it is a novel. It's not a biography. It's a novel. I did feel free to enlarge upon the story that I saw unfolded in the diary, and to, of course, invent characters and make some people worse than they actually may have been in real life, or better than they may have actually been in real life, and to really explore for myself the world of this young man, Karl, as I call him, my protagonist, my hero, Karl A. Black. Karl A. Black. Not the most original character name, I have to admit, but it's what seemed to make sense for me for this character. And I wanted to really try to understand him, and through him, my late father. And at that point in his life, he would have been 23, 24 in 1959, and facing a series of decisions and opportunities and frustrations and challenges. And I wanted to muse about those situations that my father encountered, and that I also, of course, give to Karl to negotiate and navigate around.
Did you find out anything about your father after you read the journal that you didn't know? Did anything surprise you?
Yes, because my father, my siblings could disagree, perhaps. I don't think they would. In my opinion, he was a stern and very certain and very sure person, authoritarian, and did not really exude much self-doubt or uncertainty, and was very sure of his reading of the world and of personalities, and didn't feel any need to necessarily change his mind about much as an adult. But the young man in the diary is uncertain, is doubtful, has lots of self-doubt, doesn't know what he's going to do, is contradictory, is frustrated, is yearning and hopeful and feeling his hopes dashed, and he's discouraged, and so on. He's just simply human, but at the same time has a particular set of challenges facing him, being a young black man in mid-20th century Nova Scotia, dealing with the culture of the day, the socioeconomic, political context of his time, and as I like to say, simply of courtship, which might
That's what the
always
book
be.
is about, right?
Yeah, it's a courtship novel. I think ultimately, I sometimes like to say in shorthand, it's a mashup of Jane Austen and Jack Kerouac.
Covers all the bases. Your father willed you the journal. Were you surprised that he left it to you and not to somebody else anyone else in the family?
Not really, although it was my agent, Denise Bukowski, pointed out to me that the reason why he left me the diary was so that I would write about him. And I hadn't thought about it. And I mentioned to her just in passing, oh, you know, he left me his diary. She said, oh, he wants you to write about him. And it was only when she told me that I realized that it was true. And then I thought about why. Why would he want me to write about him? And the answer was because my first novel deals with two cousins.
George and Rue.
George and Rue, two cousins of mine, my late mother's, who were hanged for murder in New Brunswick, 1949. It was a deep, dark family secret, and so on. I found out about it when I was 34, and I wrote the novel. And it came out and got good critical responses and so on. But I think my father had enough ego and vanity to think, why is my son wasting his talents writing about these two guys who are condemned murderers, for crying out loud, when he's got me to write about? And so I think that was the real reason why he wanted to make sure I got hold of the diary.
So, in an alternate universe, what do you think he would think of the novel?
Oh, well, I would like to think that he would say that he could be perhaps uncomfortable with some of the psychological portraiture, but at the same time might feel that that the novel is accurate in depicting the mood and feelings and emotions of courtship and being on the road and exploring that he experienced. And I know it was important for him, that youthful experience, because he had a motorcycle helmet that he decorated himself. And in fact, that's a big part of the diary. In the early part of 1959, during the winter, he's getting ready to get out on the road. And so it's very important for him to have this very dashing, hand-painted motorcycle helmet. And he kept it with him through the rest of his life. It was always in every living room he ever had. That helmet was front and center. So he could be reminded, I think, whenever he walked into that room, that I used to be that young guy with that small enough head to fit in that tiny helmet to jet around the countryside, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that when with our parents, we see them as parents, right? But we forget that before they were parents, they were people and they had their own interests.
It's disturbing. Think of parents being actually people with their own passions and histories and so on, which of course for the most part is usually left unknown, or big chunks of it are left unknown to progeny, to children. And that may be a very positive and very good thing. On the other hand, I was really glad to have this window into his youth, partly because it told me that when I was that age and I was uncertain and I was confused and I had a lot of self-doubt and so on, that, hey, I wasn't alone. And it runs in the family. And it's probably the same for many young people at any time, both genders, anytime.
I watched a Q&A that you did in support of the book, and you said, and I quote, there is always the possibility of excellence. That is the theme of this novel. What did you mean by that?
Thank you for that question as well. I think that often we are tempted to think, including those of us who come from marginalized or repressed or suppressed, oppressed communities, that because we come from contexts of relative deprivation or real deprivation, that therefore there is less of a possibility or opportunity for excellence to exist among us. And my father's story, and the story of many other African Canadians and other Canadians for that matter, tells us otherwise, that there is always that possibility for excellence for anyone who is interested in moving beyond the stereotypical confines of identity. So sure, there were a whole series of stereotypes that my father and other black men of his generation could have chosen to live up to or live down to, whatever, right? As opposed to setting forth their own agenda. So my father decides atypically as a young man, and I give these characteristics to Karl, that he's going to like classical music. He's going to buy a classical music record every week. And it's for him, and he loves the music, and he knows it really well. And when people come over to his apartment and express dissatisfaction with his playing of Bach or Beethoven or Brahms or whatever, he'll kindly ask them to leave, because that's his music. He likes that music. And the whole thing about being a painter and trying to be an artist, and then buying a motorcycle as opposed to a car, which would be far more practical for anyone of relatively limited means. It means you've got an extra household, for crying out loud, if necessary. All right, so he stood out for in terms of making decisions that were atypical, or at least making decisions that ran counter to what was expected in terms of stereotypes. He was a gentleman who loved using a polysyllabic, I want to say menu of terms, partly to impress, partly to intimidate, partly to surprise.
Partly to elevate himself.
To elevate himself, educate others, and stimulate conversation along. He was a great fan of the English language and loved catching people off guard who might not expect a taxi driver, someone carrying their suitcases around at the Halifax train station, to suddenly drop a line that they might expect rather from a Harvard professor or a University of Toronto professor or the like, as opposed to a humble worker providing a service. But he was someone who wanted others to know that no matter what his social economic context could be or might be, that his intellect and his imagination far exceeded those particular confines.
And they were his own. So this is 1959. That's when the novel takes place. What was life like? I know you touched a little bit about it. What was life like for Black people in Nova Scotia at the time?
It was a very interesting time because literally, it's before the 1960s. It's before the activism and relative radicalism that occurred in the Black community in Nova Scotia at that time. So it's still a relatively conservative culture, very careful, not wanting to ruffle feathers. The civil rights movement is ongoing in the United States, and of course it had its big impetus in December of '55 with the Montgomery bus boycott, led by Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, no Black person or person of color, or they would have said colored person in those days, or Negro even in Canada, would have been unaware or ignorant of that movement. On the other hand, race relations in Canada and particularly in Nova Scotia ran on a basis of a kind of politesse. If you don't make too much noise, if you don't complain too much, there might be incremental adjustment here or there to make life just a little bit easier for you or maybe for your children. And maybe one day they'll be able to do this or do that. But for now, let's just agree that things are more or less okay. And they're certainly not as bad as they are in Dixie, right? They're not as bad as theirs. So you people, and people would have said that back then, you people should be kind of happy that here you are in the Queen's Dominion, you're in Canada, and you have all the rights and so on and so forth. Now, economically, you may be deprived, and educationally, you may be backward, but give it a couple generations, another 100 years, you might just start to become a little bit more equal. But relax in the meantime, enjoy life. And so these were the kinds of attitudes people had to struggle against, that from the standpoint of the majority might have been well-meaning and actually interested in diffusing any potential racial antagonism, as opposed to actually trying to search for real social justice and achieve real social justice. So for instance, instead of having a civil rights movement like what was unfolding in the South in the United States, Nova Scotia simply abolished school segregation in 1956. Same thing in Ontario in 1960. And so the movements, the correct and proper provincial government movements to get rid of legal segregation in these two provinces in particular was very good, but it also prevented the rise of a more militant movement to more like the American movement.
I've always wondered about that. That makes sense.
Yeah, it was a typical Canadian kind of let's pacify things as opposed to actually resolving things.
And within the Black community itself, were there divisions amongst Black people, like based on color or where you're from, or?
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to have to say it like that, and I'm becoming even more animated now because one of the aspects of the diary that I'd never really thought of before, and really the novel is built around this, is the fact of class distinction. Right? And we often don't think about that because we often think about it historically, especially Black people in North America, Canada, United States, essentially occupied the same class, working poor. Working poor. That was our class, and except with the exception, especially in Canada, of clergy. Clergy and their children might have access to higher education, might be allowed or permitted to pursue other livelihoods beyond those that were demarcated for Black people, essentially low-level, unskilled service positions of one sort or another. But what was beginning to happen, and really it starts in 1949, is class stratification. I like to think of this novel as the story of how class stratification arrives for Black Nova Scotia. So we go from being collectively working poor plus a very small middle class of clergy for the most part, and some teachers, to suddenly having much more class differentiation. And the reason for that was because, in my opinion, the opening up of nursing to Black women, which begins in 1949 in Ontario and in Nova Scotia. So once Black women are able to become nurses, and some also become teachers, it means they have an entree to the middle class that they never had before, or at least not as easily before. And now there's a clear path to middle class status.
For the
Great.
black women, but not the black men.
That's right. So who are you going to marry? You become a nurse, you become a teacher. Who are you going to marry in the black community? Right? Maybe you're going to marry outside the black community, but if you want to marry inside the black community, who are you going to marry? You got to marry the guy who carries the baggage around the train station. You got to marry the shoe shine guy. You got to marry the guy who hands out the towels in the men's room at Union Station here in Toronto. Are you going to marry an unskilled, perhaps grade 3 educator or even illiterate gentleman? Make him your husband, the father of your children? Or are you going to cast your net wider, so to speak? Are you going to look for other opportunities for a potential lifelong, at least in those days, people would have thought lifelong mate, husband, spouse, and so forth. And these were the opportunities that were beginning to open up for black women in Nova Scotia, partly through those, partly in terms of those who were becoming middle-class professionals, but also in terms of even the lower working class or working poor women also suddenly had more choice in terms of husbands. And that was partly because of the Cold War. Because with the Cold War, you've got African-American sailors coming to Halifax in droves.
More competition. So
More competition.
With Karl, he has a grade 10 education. So how does this affect his view or his choices with the women?
Complicates things immensely. Because you're right, he's got grade 10, he's well-spoken, he's a great dresser, he's got, in his own mind, good music, he has his own apartment, he has a job. He should be an extremely attractive catch for most African Nova Scotian women at the time, in particular African Nova Scotian women. He should be, and he is, but he's got serious competition because as of 1955, with the West Indian Domestic Scheme, black men are allowed to come to Canada from the English-speaking Caribbean, but only as students, And so what that means is an immediate class differentiation. So the young black men arriving from the Caribbean to Canada and to Nova Scotia and to Halifax in the mid-1950s are middle class in orientation. So who are they going to date when they get to Canada, when they get to Halifax? They're going to date white women? Maybe, and some do, and that's all right. And if they're going to date the local black women, who are they going to date? Are they going to date the lower working class black women, given that they are already middle class themselves and will become more entrenched once they achieve their degree or degrees? Or are they going to date the nurses, student nurses and student teachers? Right, who's Karl is also trying to date.
Is he a sexist? Is he a misogynist?
Well, I suppose it depends how you look at it. I think that he was a product of his generation, a product of his time. And also, and the question is a very complex question because in terms of sexism, I like to think about it this way. Most black women in Nova Scotia in the 20th century, let alone the mid-1950s or later 50s, early 60s, had really very limited career opportunities. And one of them, the most open one, was to be a maid. And for a white family, not a black family, but a maid, domestic employee for a white family. What this often meant was that wife and mother, black wife and mother, was available for potential sexual harassment by the white male employer or the white family employer, and would have to put up with it because in some cases she might be the only wage earner for her family, which could be potentially sizable. And so we'd have to stay quiet, would have to put up with it, live with it, and be subject to that kind of coercion. So for a lot of black men of my father's generation, it was extremely important that their wives be at home with their children.
Because they were safe there.
Because they were safer there and would not be subject to the sexual harassment of white men. Was this sexist and patriarchal? Absolutely. But I also think it's important to remember the racial dynamics that led to that kind of thinking. So in that way, certainly Karl believes that it's the man's role to provide. It's the woman's role to take care of the household. And another aspect of this, which again, to our minds, is rightfully and correctly perceived as being sexist with a capital S and patriarchal with a capital P. The other part of this is that so many black families did not have the ability to have a parent stay at home and provide child rearing for their own children, and to have a spouse be out in the workforce earning the provision for the family, as was the case for white middle class families. So for a lot of black middle-class aspiring men of the 50s and 60s, their idea of freedom was that they would be able to have the same kind of household that they saw reflected on television and popular culture in terms of the mainstream society. That the father goes out to work, mother's at home, providing for the children, and taking care of the household and so on. And again, this kind of Leave It to Beaver vision of the family we correctly condemn today. But what I needed to understand in writing the novel was, how was it possible that many black men at that time in Nova Scotia could aspire to that model as a way of achieving for themselves a sense of equality?
It's probably, yeah, equality, and it's what's supposed to be normal, right? At the time, anyway. I want to read you a passage from the book. Despite Karl's exact grammar and rigid posture, his Gestalt sexual prowess had been briefly everyone's interest on a public trolley. From that instant, he knew himself as a Negro man, desirable to dark-complected and light-complected females. But he also now saw that he was a clear and present threat to the albino racialists who controlled Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, the British Empire, and the larger Caucasian European world. To what extent does Karl's sex drive put him in danger?
That's a great question. Well, look, we know the history, right? And particularly in terms of the United States, it's very well known. It's very clear that there were several thousand. I think the number was 4,000 lynchings between the end of the Civil War and up to the 1960s in terms of the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of that was economically motivated, and some of that was also sexually motivated, in an attempt to try to ensure that there would not be miscegenation, and particularly in terms of black men becoming lovers to or taking as wives white women, because that would upset the entire power dynamic pyramid that had been constructed all over the imperialist world, the European and American Caucasian imperialist controlled world. I don't mind using these terms because it's true. Anybody who disbelieves this can look it up, Google it, go to an encyclopedia. Don't take my word for it, but that's how the world was set up. And there was a sexual politics connected with that control, economic and military control and political control of most of the so-called colored world or third world, colonized world by European Caucasian men. And part of their rationale for that control was to make sure they had access to women of every complexion and every clime and every culture whenever they wished. On the other hand, the males that they were controlling to the point of judicial persecution and illegal murder. Of course, murder is always illegal, but what I'm trying to get at here is executions that were essentially trumped up lynchings and actual judicial murders and so forth, was to control the sexuality of the repressed and the underclass and the suppressed in order to maintain their own rule, their own power as they understood it, as they saw it. So this is the world that Karl enters. It's not his fault. This is the world that he has inherited. And so he carries the burden, so to speak, of understanding that his own genitalia, his own instruments of procreation and reproduction are considered somebody else's property, or considered to be under the potential control and certainly surveillance of others, frustrating his ability to understand himself as a full, complete human being, certainly as a full, complete male, and understanding as well that he has to negotiate this racialized sexual politics that also impinges on his courtship possibilities and opportunities. So what I'm illustrating in the novel was simply a fact of life, and everybody knew it, whether they wanted to talk about it or not. Everybody knew it, and it was part and parcel, I think, of the impact, particularly of the American Civil Rights Movement, to make it to get rid of the laws and notions against so-called miscegenation. And we should keep in mind that as late as 1967, which is only 50 years ago coming up, that it was actually illegal in some states in the United States for blacks and whites to marry. So this is the context in which Karl is coming of age as a young man.
And you get a sense of that Karl, your father for that matter, feels a greater sense of freedom. How does he do that when society is still so racist?
Getting on the bike, getting on the motorcycle that he calls Elizabeth II. And I refuse to offer any Freudian readings of this fact, but I think if you have a purple BMW, big motorcycle, and you want to name it Elizabeth II, you're making some, and you're a black man in the late 1950s, Nova Scotia, you're talking about the hit of state, for crying out loud. The queen of the realm, of the Dominion of Canada. And who is, of course, at this point in her life, particularly attractive and so on and so forth. You're making a particular point about your feelings that you have absolute equality, enough equality to, in a sense, be courting Her Majesty herself.
And to own.
Her Majesty herself, for crying out loud. It was a de facto intellectual kind of civil rights movement gesture, if I may say so.
Thank you so much for being here. We've run out of time.
Oh, man, thank you so much. Really appreciated it.
Thank you it was a great book, great book.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.